Right now, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is sitting on two different roads into the future of the Democratic Party, and either one could break the party wide open. She could challenge Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer in his own state and gut the party's leadership from the inside. Or she could run for president in 2028 and force Democrats to finally decide whether their future is progressive or centrist. Whichever door she walks through, the party on the other side does not look the same. That's the governing question of this story. Which path actually gives AOC control of the party, and what would either one cost Democrats to get there? Because this isn't a hypothetical anymore. Reporting from Politico and Axios says her team has spent the last year building infrastructure for both options at once, Senate and presidency, and treating the decision as a live strategic choice, not a distant dream. That matters because the last time a candidate this polarizing forced this kind of choice on the party, it was Bernie Sanders in 2016, and the party spent a decade arguing about what that choice cost them, whether embracing him earlier would have changed 2016's outcome, or whether accommodating him at all cost Democrats the moderate voters they needed. Ocasio-Cortez is now positioned to force a version of that same argument, except this time with actual institutional power within reach instead of a protest campaign. To understand how she got two live paths to power, you need the baseline. Ocasio-Cortez was elected to represent New York's 14th district, covering parts of the Bronx and Queens, in 2018 when she beat a 10-term incumbent in one of the biggest primary upsets in modern congressional history. She built a national profile fast through sharp media appearances, an enormous social media following now above 36 million, and a policy brand built around the Green New Deal and Medicare for all. For years, the Democratic establishment's answer to, could she lead the party, was simple: no. Her appeal, they argued, was real but narrow, limited to the most online, most progressive slice of the base, with little pull beyond it. She'd already tested that ceiling once, from the inside. In late 2022, Ocasio-Cortez sought the top Democratic seat on the powerful House Oversight Committee, a real bid for institutional power within the party, not just cultural influence, and lost to a more senior colleague chosen by her own caucus. It was a clear signal at the time. Viral popularity and grassroots money hadn't yet translated into control over the party's actual levers. Her early career was also shaped by Justice Democrats, the insurgent group that recruited and helped elect her in that 2018 upset. That relationship has since cooled, which matters for reasons this story gets to later. The point for now is that everything she's built since that oversight loss, the tour, the endorsements, the fundraising list, the courtship of institutions like Ebenezer Baptist Church that have nothing to do with New York's 14th district, reads like a direct answer to that early defeat, this time built outside the caucus rather than waiting for a vote inside it. That's the assumption this story is testing, because two things have happened since 2024 that make the establishment's old answer look shakier than it used to. The first is the Senate opening. Chuck Schumer, the top Senate Democrat, is up for re-election in 2028, and his standing inside his own party has been sliding for over a year. In May 2025, he backed a Republican-written stopgap funding bill to avoid a government shutdown, and much of his own caucus's base saw it as a cave to Donald Trump. Then, in the fall shutdown fight, Senate Democrats voted for a deal to reopen the government, and progressives were furious again, this time accusing him of failing to hold his conference together at all. A Siena College poll from that period found his favorability among New York voters down to 39%, while Ocasio-Cortez's favorability had climbed to 47%. Multiple surveys from Data for Progress since April 2025 have shown her leading Schumer by margins between 18 and 21 points in a hypothetical head-to-head Senate primary, with her advantage holding across Black, white, and Latino voters and running especially strong among voters under 45. That matters because a primary challenge to Schumer wouldn't just be one race. It would be a direct takeover of the party's Senate leadership in the media capital of the country, decided by the demographic that already trusts her most. Then, in July 2026, the second shift happened. A slate of New York congressional candidates backed by Ocasio-Cortez, Bernie Sanders, and New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani swept their primaries against establishment-aligned opponents. All 14 candidates she personally endorsed that cycle won. Democratic strategists who track New York politics told The Hill afterward that there's now little doubt Schumer will face a serious primary challenge in 2028, and even less doubt about who it would be. Asked directly about it days later, Ocasio-Cortez didn't deny it. She said she wanted to take a beat and enjoy her candidate's wins first, then added that they'd see what happens from there. In politics, that's not a no. That's a door left open on purpose. But a Senate seat alone doesn't explain why anyone is talking about her taking over the whole party. For that, you have to look at what she's actually built outside Congress over the past 18 months. Since early 2025, Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders have run a joint national tour called Fighting Oligarchy, deliberately aimed at places a sitting congresswoman from the Bronx has no obvious reason to visit: Bakersfield, California, Plattsburgh in upstate New York, Philadelphia, where she rallied for a competitive down-ballot primary candidate, Montgomery, Alabama, for a voting rights event. She addressed Atlanta's Ebenezer Baptist Church alongside Georgia Senator Raphael Warnock, notable because the church's pastor doesn't extend that platform to every visiting politician. Former Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg reportedly wasn't given the chance to speak when he visited the same month. She also met with the daughter of Martin Luther King Jr. at the King Center. None of that is accidental. It's the same playbook presidential campaigns run years before announcing building relationships in early states and with constituencies a New York House seat doesn't require. That matters because of the other resource this tour builds: money. Democratic operatives quoted by Axios estimate that if Ocasio-Cortez enters a national race, she would raise upward of $100 million in small dollar donations alone, largely by mobilizing the same grassroots donor base that fueled Sanders' 2 presidential runs, a network she spent 2 years actively cultivating rather than inheriting. That's a resource base past insurgent candidates never had at this scale, and it's a big part of why party elites who dismissed Sanders in 2016 aren't dismissing her the same way. Which brings us to the second path, the presidency. Here the picture is more complicated, and the mechanism behind her strength is different. In a CNN poll conducted in March 2025, Democratic and Democratic-leaning voters were asked which one person best reflects the core values of their party. Ocasio-Cortez came out on top, named by 10% of respondents, narrowly ahead of former Vice President Kamala Harris at 9% and Bernie Sanders at 8%. That's a symbolic win, not a delegate count, but symbolism shapes primaries. It signals whose brand of politics the base sees as authentically Democratic right now, at a moment when the party has struggled to define what it stands for after 2024. It's not only base-level polling driving that read. Nate Silver, the statistician who built his reputation calling elections before they happened, has named Ocasio-Cortez his personal favorite to win the 2028 Democratic nomination, a notable data point precisely because his read is built on modeling primary dynamics, not enthusiasm for her politics. That doesn't make it a forecast. One analyst's favorite is an opinion, not a projection, but it's a sign that people whose job is assessing primary mechanics, not activism, increasingly see a realistic path for her, not just a symbolic one. But when pollsters ask the more concrete question, who would you actually vote for in a 2028 primary? The picture splits. A Morning Consult poll from that same month showed Harris leading the full field by a wide double-digit margin, with Ocasio-Cortez running third. Other surveys, including one from Atlas in May 2025, put her closer to the front, with 26% of Democratic voters saying they'd back her in a hypothetical field. The spread between polls isn't noise. It's a real signal that her ceiling depends heavily on who else actually runs and whether Harris, California Governor Gavin Newsom, or other established Democrats consolidate the more moderate lane against her. That consolidation is exactly what hasn't happened yet, and it's the single biggest variable in this entire story. As of mid-2026, the list of Democrats who've publicly signaled interest in 2028 includes Newsom, Harris, Buttigieg, New Jersey, Senator Cory Booker, Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear, and several others, a crowded moderate to center lane with no single figure yet commanding it the way Biden eventually did in 2020. In a fractured field, a candidate with a committed 20 to 25% floor, like Ocasio-Cortez's polling suggests she has, doesn't need majority support to win early states. She needs the other 75% to stay divided long enough for delegates to add up. That's the same math that let Donald Trump win the 2016 Republican primary against a divided field of establishment rivals, a comparison Democratic strategists have made about their own 2028 field more than once. That's the catch with treating taking over the party as inevitable. Democratic strategist James Carville and journalist Al Hunt have both said publicly they don't think she'll be the 2028 nominee, arguing the party will prioritize what they call electability over ideology, and that a self-described democratic socialist, in their view, doesn't fit that lane. Political scientist Jacob Neiheisel has framed the deeper uncertainty this way. Whether AOC has real appeal depends on how Democrats interpret their 2024 loss. If the party's internal story is that Kamala Harris was too cautious, someone like Ocasio-Cortez benefits. If the story is that the party moved too far left already, she doesn't. As of mid-2026, that internal argument inside the party is still unresolved. There's also a structural counterargument that goes beyond messaging. Writers at The New Republic have pointed out that Ocasio-Cortez would enter a primary carrying nearly every trait party strategists have historically treated as a liability in a general election, stacked together in one candidate. She'd be a woman, a person of color, a self-identified democratic socialist, and waiting at 39 on Election Day, 2028, wow, unusually young for the office. Older voters who turn out at far higher rates than younger ones have historically been the deciding bloc in Democratic primaries, and that dynamic doesn't obviously favor her. It's the same fear that shaped the party's move toward Joe Biden in 2020. The search for the candidate seen as the safe bet against Donald Trump. Whether that instinct still holds in 2028 after two competitive losses in a row is genuinely contested inside the party, not settled. There's a live test of that electability argument happening right now, and it isn't about AOC at all. In Michigan, progressive organizer Abdul El Sayed is running for Senate as a Sanders and Ocasio-Cortez aligned candidate in one of the true swing states that decides presidential elections, while being outspent by his opponents roughly 12-1. If he wins both his primary and the general election, progressives inside the party plan to treat it as proof that insurgent, unapologetically left politics can actually win where it matters, not just in safe Democratic districts in New York City. That would hand Ocasio-Cortez, or whichever progressive runs in 2028, a concrete electability argument to counter Carville's. If El Sayed loses either race, skeptics get to say the opposite, that the model doesn't travel outside deep blue turf. Either way, the outcome in Michigan is a genuine, testable data point arriving before 2028, not spin from either camp. It's also worth naming the argument on the other side of Carville's, because dismissing it outright would be its own kind of bias. Writers sympathetic to Ocasio-Cortez, including at The Nation, argue that electability as a concept has a track record of being wrong, used in past cycles to steer the party away from candidates who were female, non-white, or economically left, only for the eventual safe nominee to lose anyway. By that argument, calling AOC unelectable before a single vote is cast isn't a neutral read of the data. It's a repeat of the same instinct that underestimated her 2018 primary win in the first place. Both arguments are live, inside the party right now. Neither has been settled by an actual election. Moderate party strategists have gone further than general skepticism. They've started wargaming the specific scenario that worries them most. John Cowan, president of the center-left group Third Way, described what he called his nightmare scenario for 2028. Kamala Harris running again, splitting off a large share of black voters from whichever moderate candidate the party's center settles on, while Ocasio-Cortez consolidates the left behind her, leaving the moderate lane too fractured to win outright. Cowan said he doesn't currently expect Harris to run again, but the scenario itself reveals what centrist strategists fear isn't really AOC in isolation. It's AOC benefiting from exactly the kind of fractured field this story just described. Even her closest allies complicate the picture. Reporting from Axios in early 2026 described friction between Ocasio-Cortez and parts of the Democratic Socialists of America, the group that helped launch her first campaign in 2018, including her declining to endorse her own former chief of staff in a separate 2026 primary. That's not a scandal. It's evidence that consolidating the left behind her isn't automatic, even among people who built her career. So which path does the evidence favor? Look at where her numbers are strongest and where the resistance is weakest. In a Senate primary against Schumer in New York, she starts with a double-digit lead, a hostile electorate toward the incumbent, and no plausible establishment alternative built to stop her. In a national presidential primary, she starts with real strength on values and identity, but faces a fractured field, an unresolved argument about electability, and a demographic turnout pattern that has hurt candidates like her before. That asymmetry matters beyond Ocasio-Cortez herself. If she takes the Senate seat, she inherits a leadership position and reshapes the party's congressional wing without ever facing the harder national test. If she runs for president instead and wins the nomination, she settles on for the first time since 2016 whether the party's most energized, online, and youngest voters actually control its direction, or whether the coalition that nominated Biden in 2020 and Harris in 2024 still calls the shots when it counts. Either result changes how every future Democratic candidate positions themselves for a generation, and taking over the party would mean more than winning one office. It would mean the infrastructure behind her, the small-dollar donor lists, the endorsement network that just went 14 for 14 in New York, the alliance with a sitting big-city mayor in Mamdani, the joint operation with Sanders, becomes the operating machine other Democrats have to go through to win primaries of their own. The way the Clinton-era establishment machine once was, and the way Obama's coalition became after 2008. That's a different kind of power than a Senate seat or even the presidency alone. It's control over who gets to run as a Democrat with real resources behind them, in races far below the top of the ticket. Down-ballot candidates in New York have already started running as explicitly Ocasio-Cortez aligned to win primaries, which is exactly how a party's center of gravity actually shifts. Not through one election, but through hundreds of smaller ones deciding which brand of Democrat gets the resources to compete at all. It also changes how Republicans campaign. Conservative commentators have openly said they'd welcome an Ocasio-Cortez nomination, betting it would energize their own base and hand them an easier general election argument. The same socialist-framing Republicans have already tested against Zohran Mamdani in New York City on the theory that it travels just as well nationally as it does locally. White House officials have publicly mocked the Sanders-Ocasio-Cortez tour as a political liability for Democrats rather than a threat. Whether either red is right is genuinely unproven. General election matchups involving her haven't been tested at meaningful scale, national moods shift over a 2-year runway, and the same unelectable insurgent playbook was run against Barack Obama in 2007 before he won twice. What isn't in dispute is that both parties are already treating her as a plausible nominee, spending real strategic energy on her, rather than dismissing her as a fringe protest candidate. That alone marks a shift from where this conversation stood even 3 years ago. So here's where this actually stands. Ocasio-Cortez has not announced a run for anything. She has said, in her own words, that whether she runs depends on where she believes she can make the most change, not on titles. But the mechanics she'd need for either path, money, a coalition, a rationale the base already believes, are already in motion. The Senate case is the stronger one on the numbers available today. The presidential case is the more transformative one if it succeeds. Watch 3 things before this settles. First, whether Chuck Schumer files for re-election at all or steps aside and removes the Senate path's central obstacle. Second, how Abdul El-Sayed's Michigan Senate race actually finishes, the closest thing to a real-world electability test the left has on the board before 2028. And third, how the 2026 midterm results shape the argument already running inside the party about whether Kamala Harris's loss means Democrats should move left or move back toward the center. None of those questions will be fully answered by the time most people finish watching this video, and any one of them could still flip the picture. But together, they'll tell you more about whether AOC takes over the Democratic Party than any poll taken this far out ever could.